Like my best example of that is actually Mission Impossible. You know, you light the fuse, and as it's going, there's a musical progression of flute, and then strings, and then brass instruments come in, and Congo drums come in, and a big splash at the end. So if you emulate that even in its structure too closely, you can get an angry letter that says you copied us, but then when it's dissected by somebody like me, they'll see, well, actually the melodies aren't the same. What they copied was your instrumentation, and you don't own that.
In a world gone mad, there's 21 kilohertz.
All right, so it's just me today, so Jeff's away. This is actually part 2 of our interview with Judith Finell. Judith, I don't know if you remember last week, we talked about the Marvin Gaye case, blurred lines, and what is copyright and what makes something a copy. Well, today we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But first, let me take you back to April 1983. That's when NBC aired The Return of the Man from U.N.C.L.E, the 15 years later affair. I don't know if you've seen this, but it was fantastic. The thing that always struck me about this was bad network television from the 80s. It's exactly what you expect. Paunchy heroes, bad car chases, backlot sets, everything was thrown together in 20 minutes. But they had this one character in it named JB. Here's the thing about JB. British, wearing a tuxedo, driving an Aston Martin, had a theme song that sounded almost like James Bond but wasn't. They never said it was James Bond, but every hint was there. The music was the giveaway. It wasn't James Bond, but it was really close. They came right up to the edge of James Bond, but it wasn't James Bond. Where is the edge? Copy something but not copy something? How can you go right up to the edge but not go over? And that's what we're going to talk to Judith about tonight. We're going to talk about these things called sound-alikes. But we're also going to discuss Stairway to Heaven, the transporter sound from Star Trek, the Mission Impossible theme, and a little 45 record that McDonald's gave away in the 1990s. All right, and one more thing. I just got to apologize. I promised I would never apologize for bad audio, but I'm breaking my promise. We had an audio screw-up, and Jeff's questions are unfortunately on the telephone. So apologies. Anyway, it's still a great interview.
The Led Zeppelin case that recently came up. It was Led Zeppelin, Stairway to Heaven, and they had a band, if I recall correctly, called Spirit that opened for them, and they had a song called Taurus. And I personally, I go and I listen to the song Taurus, and then I listen to Stairway to Heaven, and I got to tell you, it's the same freaking thing, at least to my layman ears.
Isn't that what we were discussing before? Exactly.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if you'd like to offer an opinion on that, because when I listen to it, I'm just stunned that, the jury found that Zeppelin did not copy Taurus. I mean, it's just, like I said, I'm not a musician, but damn, it sounds the same.
Well, I can comment as an outside party. Truthfully, I'm asked about that case a lot, of course. There are a few things. First of all, the judge on that case, who was also a judge in California, in Los Angeles, as was the Blurred Lines case, followed the lead of the Blurred Lines judge and said that the original song by Taurus could not be played for the jury because of the year in which it was composed. So they did the same thing. They said it could only use the lead sheet, and that introductory part that's similar to Stairway to Heaven wasn't on the lead sheet. So they eliminated the similar portion from the jury's experience entirely, number one. And number two, because it's, if you're familiar with some musical terminology, as you probably are, the similarity was on the guitar. There was a guitar portion that played what you call an arpeggio, which is a chord that's played note for note instead of all the notes at the same time. So, so you basically pick at the guitar one note at a time. If you have a C chord like C, E, G, instead of playing all three notes so you strum it like a chord, you're playing them individually. C, maybe followed by E, followed by G, etc. So it was a series of what you call arpeggios that were similar between the works, as well as a few other similarities. But the defense expert on the side of the writers of Stairway to Heaven was able to find much music going back a long time, probably centuries, that use that because it's a building block of music in arpeggio. It's like saying that the chord is the same, but the chord wasn't originated by, by either band. and it could be found in the musical literature, and I think that was pretty powerful. I wasn't at the trial, but I believe that was quite powerful.
So you mentioned that you kind of talk about sound-alikes, which is kind of, I always think of it as James Bond music, but it's not James Bond music. It's for when you want to use James Bond music, but you don't want to pay for the original composition. How do you deal with that, in the sense of that seems like it's something like you were talking about a second ago, it's made to go right up to the edge, but where's the edge, and how do you decide what the edge is?
It's designed that way.
Exactly.
Well, that's something we deal with every day because we work with a lot of ad agencies and video game producers, and they want to evoke that other song or whatever is associated with the song, whether it's a character theme song or whatever. Yes, and they don't want to pay for it, or they've even been told they can't do it. They've asked to license it, and they've been turned down. And then they go out and they hire a composer. They'll send, not only will they say, write something that sounds like this, but here's a, track. Here's what we actually want, and it's called the temp track. And they've often even synced that particular music to whatever visual it's connected with in the commercial or the film or the whatever visual connection there is to the music. So, they've lined it all up, and they basically say, come as close as you can. And by the way, we're in a big hurry and we need this, pronto. Not every composer is aware of the dangers there, for one thing, and is in a hurry. And composers vary in their ability to do that because many of them are not formally trained at all, and they really just go by their ears. They don't have that kind of depth in their background. They're very skilled and talented at what they do, but they don't know exactly how to avoid the problem. They don't have a toolbox in the same way. So,
and does that get pulled into court a lot?
Well, often it gets settled, but yeah, there are people shaking their rattles at each other. Absolutely, cease and desist letters go flying. Yes, especially if it's a major, like an international product, and it's being launched, say, at something like the Super Bowl, and all of a sudden, everybody comes after you because you don't even know it sometimes that the composer you hired, found it much more expedient to, copy that and just modify it a little bit, and really didn't modify it enough. Often we're hired to help avoid those problems, to be honest with you, since we can see what happens.
So you almost get brought in earlier as a kind of a forensic to prove that something is not like it. This is not the James Bond theme. Is that what your role would be?
Well, yeah, often we're asked to, we're really consulted in the studio as to how to make changes so it still evokes the mood you want to evoke, without evoking the other music and not copying it so closely. So we often are hired to prevent that exact scenario from occurring. But sometimes they don't hire us until they've gotten sued. Depends on how proactive they are and what kind of risk. When it's a big international product, they're usually more careful.
But I'm just curious, when you're in the recording studio and you're sitting there and it's like, well, it's a little too close to James Bond, what would you tell them? Bring this, how do you walk up to James the edge but not be on the edge?
That's a common one. James Bond is a distinctive melody and it has distinctive qualities and an unusual chord change at the end. There's like specific things that you need to avoid, and if you use them and it's similar. Like my best example of that is actually Mission Impossible, which is a whole series of sort of musical events from the first time that, I don't know if you ever watched it, but even the visual is, you light the fuse, and as it's going, there's a musical progression of flutes and then strings and then brass instruments come in and Congo drums come in at the end and a big splash at the end. So if you emulate that even in its structure too closely, you may evoke a response which may not be able to be substantiated. You can get an angry letter that says you copied us, but then when it's dissected by somebody like me, they'll see, well, actually the melodies aren't the same. What they copied was your instrumentation, and you don't own that. So sometimes you can fight it off. But remember, that costs a lot of money and lawyers, so it's better not to do it.
Is there a particular case that you've worked on that stands out for you more than others, or that you found personally, intellectually fascinating that perhaps others would not?
Well, I've been on a lot of cases for a long time. Some of them, one of the more interesting ones, I guess, was one many years ago involving a McDonald's commercial. And this is public record, so I'm not really telling you anything that I shouldn't. But basically, McDonald's came out with a series, a contest in which if you were able to replicate this particular jingle, you would win $1 million. And what they did was they in the days that people actually read physical newspapers and it got them delivered on Sundays, the big fat newspaper that we all have in New York, but they also had throughout the country. There was a little floppy disk that was like a throwaway type of recording that looked like the size of a 45 record. And in there was this long list sung, a melody in which there was a whole list of what they called the menu of McDonald's. So they listed like everything McDonald's sold, BLT, but in a rhythm. It was like what you'd think of today as a rap, but this was earlier in time. So it was like a chant just on one note, and this went on for 175 repetitions. And it was like every single menu item that McDonald's sold. And if you could do that entire chant in one breath without taking a breath, and record it and send it to McDonald's, you could win $1 million. So I get a call from some songwriter who says they took my song. And not only do I think it, but there's a DJ in upstate New York who's put it together and overlapped my song with that. And sure enough, he had written a song that wasn't very well known, but it was built on a repetition of information from beginning to end in the same rhythm, the same note, the same concept, even the same, much of the same harmony, and it was really very close. And it really seemed that McDonald's had used that as their model. And here, the reason it was such a challenge was it was one note, but it was repeated a lot. So it was very minimalistic. It was one note repeating a list of information, basically.
Wow.
And so we were able to show that that was unusual. In those days, you could call it, there was operetta written, for example, by Gilbert and Sullivan, and this is where the musical background comes in sometimes, where they had a series of songs in their operettas called patter songs, in which the singer would sing a long chant, usually a single note or one or two notes, but it wasn't melodic. It was mostly a chant of information. And this was a whole genre. And clearly this McDonald's commercial had decided to capture that and take it. So their defense was, this is just a patter song, and there are hundreds of patter songs. But we really were able to show just how close it was. And also, under testimony, eventually there was an admission that they'd had that song as their model and had basically circulated in the ad agency. So that was challenging because the music was so minimalistic.
Well, along the same lines is, what about a sound? You talk about one note. What about the again, going back to Star Trek, the sound of the transporter, the sound of the phaser? Those are incredibly iconic sounds. You know what they are immediately. Can I just use them? I mean, since it's just a one or two notes, or is that something that you can own, you can copyright and defend?
You can own, I think there are, now I'm not a lawyer, but I believe there's both trademarks and sounds for devices, for example, as well as the copyright. It sound, it still has musical properties. Like, Law and Order has that, that sound at the beginning of each scene, etc. And it's pretty distinctive. And when you see a parody of it, you know that that's what they're parodying. When you see a commercial or something else that's a takeoff on it, or Saturday Night Live and all. But in essence, that's what it is. So I'd say a sound itself has properties. It has duration. It has a high or a low frequency. It may not be quite the same as tones, but it has sonority in terms of, does it sound like a brass instrument? Does it sound like an electronic? And certainly a lot of music incorporates all kinds of sound effects, machine gun sounds, bombs dropping, all kinds of sound effects are in recordings, and but they have a specific time that they occur within the structure of the song. So really, we treat them as really just another musical element.
Do you get involved in cases that deal with sampling or mashups?
Oh, yes, all the time.
How does Girl Talk get away with doing what Girl Talk does? And Girl Talk is a DJ that will literally splice samples from maybe 100 recordings of compositions into 1.5 minute song, and it's just this flurry of samples. And how do they get away with that?
Well, I always use Girl Talk in my presentations because it is pretty amazing. I think the answer must be financially, that Girl Talk isn't actually financially gaining from the recordings. So maybe there's nothing really to come after. I don't know the answer on any technical or legal basis why Girl Talk has gotten away with it, but certainly many other very well-known artists do go to great lengths to pay for the samples that they're using, and that all began because of the first case where the judge, it was, I think it was called the Biz Markie case, in which sampling had occurred from a song called Alone Again Naturally. And it was the first time that I know of at least, that someone took them to court, and the judge in New York, at the top of his opinion, instead of talking about musical or legal issues, said, "Thou shalt not steal." And over the years, all of a sudden, like overnight, a whole licensing for sample industry began from nothing. So the fact is that once you call them into court, the music industry adapts and finds ways to pay for what they've done. But there's always that element where it's been stolen for a while.
The only thing I would add, and this is one of these kind of like odd questions in the sense of originality, if you take, like Jeff was talking about Girl Talk, when does something become its own composition? And is this something that you even get called in on, in the sense that, obviously you've got mashups, you've got sampling, you've got everything. Is there a point in your mind where something can stand on its own and is its own composition, or is everything derivative now?
I don't think everything's derivative at all. There's still room for lots of originality, but it's become very easy because of the cheapness of technology for individuals and amateurs to create their own music, whereas they usually would have needed so much expensive apparatus, a couple decades ago, that you didn't find people creating their own musical works from other pieces, which are basically mosaics of other people's materials. Maybe they feel they put them together creatively. But you got that combined with the world is available to create access to your creation that wasn't before. One of the requirements of a copyright infringement case is that you must prove that the party that you're accusing had access to your music. Well, before YouTube and other forms and social media and other forms of sharing music, some guy writes a piece in his garage in Sweden, and how likely is it that, a very well-known artist in California has actually heard it? So you had to prove that you have to bring in people to testify that it was playing on the radio in this vicinity or that vicinity, etc., and to actually prove that the person had the opportunity to be exposed to it. Well, that's really changed, and that's because of technology.
21 Kilohertz is sponsored by Audium. Audium gets songwriters, composers, and music publishers paid for the digital use of their music. If it streams on Spotify, Rhapsody, Tidal, YouTube, or is downloaded on iTunes, Amazon, or any other digital music service, you deserve to get paid the money you earned. Audium works for Metallica, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Jason Mraz, Jimmy Buffett, and thousands more. To get started, simply go to audium.com, provide your information, and collect your money. Audium. AUDIAM. Get paid for the use of your music.
Opening narration provided by Karin Gilfrey. Need the perfect voice for your corporate videos? How about some narration for your year-end presentation? What about a scintillating voice for your in-house voicemail system? For more information, go to karingilfrey.com. That's CARINGILFRY.com. All music on 21 Kilohertz is provided by freeplaymusic.com. Freeplay Music is an online, searchable music library anyone can use. At Freeplay Music, you can search and license songs to use in your video, your project advertisement, your business presentation, your movie blockbuster, your video game, or your kitty cat fashion show. Anything else you could think of. Tonight's song was My Wooden Chances, an edgy and suspenseful, tension-filled TV and film score from the album Action and Adventure, Volume 12.